Welcome back to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast, brought to you by the Gazette and non-Iowa Sports. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter, John Steppe. I'm excited to be joined by Iowa football assistant head coach, assistant defensive coordinator, and linebackers coach, Seth Wallace. Seth, thanks for joining me.
Hey, John, appreciate you having me. This is, always a good deal for our staff. And, I'm excited to be on with you today.
So let's start off talking with your room in 2025. Obviously lost some key pieces after this season to graduation. Unfortunately, you could only get so many extra years of eligibility for Nick Jackson. But, we saw a little bit of Jaden Harrell with that UCLA game, saw a bit of an extended run from him. It seems like Carson Shire has been a name that we have seen in kind of the open practices as a guy who's been making plays. Obviously you're seeing them on a daily basis. What gives you confidence about this group as they fill the void, as they fill a pretty big void left by Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson and Kyler Fisher as well?
Yeah, John, I think the confidence is, it comes with experience. It comes with history. This isn't necessarily a situation that we've, that we haven't experienced before. Like this is, there was the changing of the guard when Josie Jewell left and Ben Neiman left. You had the same thing when Christian Welch and Nick Neiman left. And then, now we're a few years removed from Campbell and Benson. And, now we're talking about, how is this thing going to work now that Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson, have transitioned out of here. And, I would just say that, the big thing is, each of those guys that I just mentioned, they all had significant opportunity within our program to develop as a linebacker, develop as a leader. And, it took a little bit of time. There were some hiccups that we had to endure when we did go through this with those other examples. And, the same is going to be the case with Jaden Harrell, Jackson Rexroth, Carson Shire, Jaden Montgomery. There's a handful of names that I think have to be thrown in there as candidates and guys that'll take the field for us in the 25 season at the linebacker position. But I think history and the experience and the opportunity that these guys have had to grow and learn within the room and within our program is going to provide them with what is needed to be, that next story that, the transitions in the linebacker room.
And then with Jack Campbell, it seemed like you couldn't take him off the field if you wanted to. With Jay Higgins, I think he was second on the team in terms of defensive snap count. Another guy that you can't really take off the field unless he was hurt against UCLA. So do you see, kind of rotationally speaking, do you see it as once you figure out who your guys are out of fall camp, these are our guys and they're going to be taking 700, 800 snaps? Do you see it more of as a rotation? Where would you like that to be?
I think, John, time will tell. We've got the 6.5 week period of the summer, in which is a big developmental period for these guys. It's an opportunity for those guys to continue to shape the picture, which will exist, that first week, of the season. And what that looks like, I think, is still yet to be determined. I'm certainly open to either or, as much as you'd like to have, Jack Campbell out there, for every snap, or Josie Jewell or Jay Higgins or Seth Benson. Those were all situations where that's how it played out. And, I do think you have to be very open-minded, especially when you've got a handful of candidates that have positioned themselves to go into the summer and then go into fall camp, battling for those positions. And I think if it looks clear that, there's 2 or 3 guys, then that's the direction you go in. But if there's 4 or 5 guys that have positioned themselves to make a case for a rotation, you certainly have to be open to that as well. And I think we're fortunate right now that we do have, a group of guys that, can make an argument that, we may be, playing guys, situationally, because they've given themselves that opportunity.
With Jaden Montgomery, how much or how helpful is it when you've got a guy in the room who obviously has a father who is quite familiar and has coached the sport in terms of kind of development for a guy like that?
Yeah, I think, everybody's got a unique background. And, I think if you look at it, like we've, specifically to the linebacker position, like we've been very strategic in terms of, background on the guys in the room from a recruiting standpoint and what we're looking for. And in case of Jaden Montgomery, the legacy piece of it is a real big deal. That's the case of a handful of guys that you've seen come through our program that have had, unbelievable experiences here and done extremely well, both on and off the field. And, that's the direction that Jaden's headed in right now. That's been his development to this point. But his ties to the program are so significant because of, both his mother and father, his father specifically being a football alum, transitioning to, life after football as a coach and the success that he's had. So Jaden thinks the right way. He thinks the right way, operates the right way. He's done, outstanding in the classroom, and his development on the field has positioned him to be in that conversation when it comes to fall camp and as we get, going into the season.
Does it feel different when you're going in? It seems like last year there's no question, obviously, when you got Jay Higgins and Nick Jackson, obviously when you had Jack Campbell coming back, there's not really much of a question there. Is it all kind of refreshing, I guess, as a coach to kind of have a little more to think about in fall camp?
Yeah. Refreshing. Yes. Yeah. It's just, anytime you transition from one year to the next, there's a restart and there's things that you've got to, think about. You've got a checklist of things, and the checklist is a little bit more, a little bit bigger, when you do lose guys to graduation or to eligibility in Nick's case, and you have to move on. So there's a handful of boxes that in years past may have been checked that aren't checked right now. And, that's what we've been working on since we turned the page back in January is, figuring out where this group is at right now and what is needed to position ourselves, and give ourselves an opportunity to play at a high level once we get to August.
And then you brought in quite the crop of in-state guys last year. I think all highly rated in the recruiting system. Obviously, that's not a foolproof method and probably would have been higher rated, you'd probably say, if they didn't commit quite as early as they did. What have you seen from them kind of in their first year actually in the building, in the program with Preston Reese, Derek Weisskopf, and Cam Buffington?
Yeah, I think, just going back to the recruiting, like that, it doesn't happen very often. I can't imagine that will be replicated anytime in the near future when you find three guys at one position, all within a 75-mile radius in your backyard, that you end up getting those guys. And their development up to this point has been very significant. I think some of it is on record, some of the numbers that these guys have had with Ray and his staff and their strength and performance development. But what they've done on the field and in the short term has been pretty significant. I think everybody in the building would tell you that these three guys operate the way in which we would like them to, but certainly in the way in which the guys that are currently here that are ahead of them right now are operating, and then guys that we've had in the past, whether it be, linebackers specifically from Iowa, or, whether it be linebackers in general. These guys they've handled their business in a first class manner. And, my guess is their development will continue to work on an upward trajectory. And, I wouldn't be surprised if all three of these guys are out there on the field for us in significant roles. And whether that be at the linebacker position or not, these guys are all going to follow suit with the transition that younger guys have had on our team, where they've stepped in and played significant roles on special teams. And that's usually how the story starts, with developmental guys, specifically at the linebacker position. And they've all, the linebacker position has played a core in our special teams units, and these guys, my guess is, will do the same very quickly.
Speaking of recruiting, you've got Chicagoland as part of your recruiting territory. It's been an area that Iowa has recruited very well, despite having a lot of competition. I think almost any team that would have been in the Big Ten West when that existed would like to be good at recruiting Chicago. What's the key to having so much success in such an important area for you geographically, where you're also competing with so many other programs?
Yeah, I think, there are, I would start by, singling out our university. And, our university has such a strong footprint in the Chicagoland area. And I'm talking general student body. There are so many kids that are moving around Iowa City during the academic calendar that have come from the Chicagoland area. So I think the success and the notoriety behind Iowa and the Chicagoland starts with, what we've done from an admissions standpoint, and how we've targeted the Chicagoland area to supplement, our student body. And in return, that then puts so many graduates of the University of Iowa back in the Chicagoland area and in their professional roles. And a lot of the student body is transitioned back into the education side, in the Chicagoland area. So when you walk in a building and you see so many, Iowa flags hanging in academic classrooms, you see it, when you walk in the door and you go to the front office, you see Iowa license plates, or Iowa, bumper stickers, so to speak, on the back of cars in the parking lot. That to me is where it starts. And then in return, it makes it easier to go into a school and talk about, a university that has accomplished so much, that we have, that we're 3.5 hours away. And in some cases, it's less than that. The two linebackers I recruited last year that both joined our program, here in January as mid-years. Both of those young men they're from the western suburbs of Chicago, and their travel here is, without traffic is, 2.5 hours. And so that's what makes it nice. I think it all starts with just, how the rich history we have. Generally speaking, the University of Iowa tied to the Chicagoland makes it real easy to go in there from a recruiting standpoint, and and have some, I guess, just the tie to the University of Iowa. And then, that being said, the history that we've had, dating back to the early 2000s with Chicagoland kids, Tony Moyaki, is a name that goes all the way back. Those guys have come here, they've had success, and we've done that with guys in between, up until, this past year, and the success that we're having in the Chicagoland area, where, you don't have to go in there and try to drum up names that guys are familiar with that have had success. Lucas Van Ness, most recently being a first-round draft pick out of Barrington. You throw those names out to these kids, and they immediately, know all about their story. And then, the last thing that I would share with you about the Chicagoland area, there's been a ton of stability in the Chicagoland area with high school coaches. That when you walk in, different from maybe other places, across the country, where you walk in the school, you're seeing the same face that you've seen for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and that's easy to recruit to. When you're seeing the same name on the door when you walk into a head coach's office, and he knows all about our program. And the one other thing that I'd share with you is we're unique. We've had a head coach for 27 years, and that head coach has been in place. He's been in all these high schools. He's been around these head coaches and administrators, that they know exactly what they're getting when they send a kid over to Iowa. So to me, it's a lot of that. And then, personally, I've recruited the Chicagoland area, now going on 8 or 9 years, and I'm really the only area coach that we have in Chicago. So, it is, you're not dividing up the Chicagoland area between 4 different coaches. You're going in there as one coach trying to manage the whole area by yourself. And we found a way to do it. And when our position coaches get involved with the Chicagoland kids, that's usually the transition. It goes from the area coach to the position coach. We've had success at every position with Chicagoland kids. So it makes it real nice to be able to go in there, and we're fortunate to have stability with our staff, where when the D-line coach goes in there, the D-line coach, has been recruiting Chicagoland, just like the area coach has. And Kelvin's name is recognizable in Chicagoland as the area coach's name. So, that's where we're fortunate.
Have you seen the competition change much in terms of other schools maybe vying more or vying less for kind of that region of prospects?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. It's, Chicagoland, at one point in time, it was recruited in a very regional sense, that Michigan State was going in there, obviously Wisconsin, the Big Ten West, the old Big Ten West, if you were to take out some of the teams that have joined or did join, within the last, 8 or 9 years. But now it's the Chicagoland is being recruited on a more national scale now. And, Notre Dame has always been in the Chicagoland area because of the regional tie. But, now you're starting to see, Miami's in there, USC's in there, schools on the East and West Coast are going in there. So I don't want to say it's being over recruited, because it's not. There are a lot of good football players, high school football players in the Chicagoland area, and in return, they're drawing a lot of interest. But where you didn't see some of these schools, on a national scale, come into Chicago, that's certainly picked up. And a lot of that is driven by social media and how much information actually gets out there, nationally, and in regards to kids that now you're seeing every school in the country in Chicago.
And also, kind of along the recruiting front, we're recording this a couple of days after the final approval of the House settlement. Obviously, you've been operating under the plan of having the portion of that $20.5 million that goes to football, and paying these guys. How has that influenced recruiting? Obviously, guys didn't used to have agents. Kind of how have the dynamics shifted in terms of how you recruit a guy now versus how you would have recruited a guy, say, 5 years ago, even?
Yeah, it's we're fortunate that the settlement, that there were actually some decisions that were made, and there's now a plan that's in place, and hopefully in the near future, all of this, starts to shape itself, because there was zero shape to what we were doing, in the previous, whatever it's been, 36 months leading up until this settlement. So we'll see a certain shift, so to speak, when it comes to the plan that'll be in place in regards to the settlement, and it's all really positive. It's extremely positive that we're going to have some guidelines to follow, and there's going to be some methods that are going to be taken away from the recruiting process that has existed up to this point. So, I think hopefully it's been a breath of fresh air that this is finally, the area, the world that we're going to live in. But, a lot of things have changed. And you go back 5 years ago, John, and, that's when there was some normalcy to recruiting. And then there was reason to transition into the NIL world. And then the NIL world just became so big, and there were no guidelines around it. There was no restrictions, that something needed to happen. And now that's happened. And, what we're looking at moving forward, hopefully will be, not, it's certainly not going to be normal, but, hopefully we can find a way to normalize it and put some guidelines around it that, maybe will create a little bit more competitive balance, so to speak, instead of just, a world that had no restrictions on it, that just made it, it made conversations and recruiting, in some cases obnoxious. In some cases, you're trying to figure out what is real here. The numbers that were being floated, what are the what's the contract actually look like, when you are talking NIL numbers, so there was just a lot. And, hopefully we found a way to get it back to where everybody can operate in a world in which, we know what the plan and the rules are behind it.
Turning the clock back a little bit, back to your playing days, how much did, playing at the D3 level, at Coe, kind of just up the road, how did that kind of influence who you are today as a person and as a coach?
I think it's, it all starts with relationships, and whether those relationships are, player related, or whether they're coach related. That's really where, that's really where things started for me. Is, I had the opportunity to play at Coe for 4 years. Was recruited by a handful of other Division III, programs in the state. Grew up a coach's kid who coached at the Division III level. So I kind of knew, if this was the direction that I wanted to go in, that, it was going to exist at the Division III level. And, I had the opportunity to go to Coe and play there for 4 years, and did it with a bunch of guys, that I was familiar with, coming out of high school, a bunch of guys that I had either played against or played with. A handful of guys from my high school team transitioned up there as well. Had an opportunity to play for two different head coaches, two different, well-regarded head coaches, DJ Leroy for my first 3 years, and then Eric Rayburn, who, is still a head coach now at the Division II level out on the East Coast. And Eric was the one that gave me the opportunity when my playing days were over to, get a start in coaching. And, so yeah, the significance behind me playing at the Division III level and how that's led to, the journey that I've taken in my coaching career is very significant. And, I was reminded of that yesterday when Fred Jackson, who I played with, and, Fred went on and made an unbelievable story for himself as a Division III player, playing in the National Football League. But, Fred was here yesterday with his wife and his 3 girls, dropping off his oldest son, Braden, to join our program. So, it just, there's a lot that I'm appreciative of my time at Coe and the people I was around. And, Baron Bremner was our athletic director when I first got there, and Baron was extremely good to me. And, so just, there's a lot, that I'm thankful for when it comes to the path that, has shaped my career to this point.
Did you ever think about playing for your dad at Grinnell?
You'd have to dig up this article that I think I was asked that question by Mark Morehouse, maybe in 2019, when he ran a story on my career up to that point, and he asked that question. And I'd share it with you, and I say it with a smile. Grinnell is I would have loved to have had the opportunity to play for my father. Grinnell is a very prestigious academic institution. And, I would tell you that my academics were, they weren't worth bragging about, in regards to, just how the recruiting process works and opportunities that present themselves. But, I did get a chance to watch my brother play for my father. And I know he had an opportunity to do something that, I think everybody, hopes to, maybe get that chance if your father is a coach, but I didn't have that opportunity because of the academic standards at Grinnell College. But, it worked out. I ended up having the opportunity to play against my father, and, every time in which he wasn't playing because of a bye week, or, he was in the stands. So, it was good.
And then kind of when you have, to be teammates with Fred Jackson, could you have ever imagined that then you'd have a moment like you had yesterday with Move-In Day, where, his kid is now part of a program, a Division I program that you're the assistant head coach of?
No, no. I don't know that I would have ever imagined that. Going back to, it would have been, I think Fred got there in 99. Might have been Fred's first year. It might have been 98. I'm losing track of time, but you knew there was something special with Fred when he got there. I don't think I ever thought beyond that. I knew I had the opportunity to play with somebody that was going to write a pretty special story for himself. And then, did that for 2 years, and then had the opportunity to coach Fred for 2 years as I joined the program and the coaching staff. And, you knew that there was something that was going to be pretty significant with Fred, in his career. But I don't know that I ever thought that, however, when Fred moved back to Ankeny, and started to have a family, and, you could see similarities in what Braden was accomplishing. And I think Fred would be the first to admit that Braden's accomplished more than Fred did, in regards to his high school career up to this point, to include what Braden did, a couple of weeks ago at the state track meet, which is real significant. So, you started paying attention to that about 5 or 6 years ago when Braden's name, started to be mentioned, that, okay, this could be pretty cool that you got the opportunity to be a part of the recruiting of somebody that you played with and then coached, and with their son, which is, pretty cool.
Your time as a graduate assistant from 06 to 08 here, kind of what were your first impressions of Iowa, and kind of how did that lead into obviously a long career and as a member of the, full coaching staff?
Yeah, my first impressions of this place, really center around 3 different individuals, and Coach Ferentz being the first, and the opportunity that I had to join his staff, having fully respected everything that he had done in that would have been the first 7 years of his career here. Because I was in football. I was around all those stories, and just had, the utmost respect for what he was doing here and what he had accomplished in the short term. And then the other 2, of significance, in terms of influence, and, would have been Norm Parker and then Phil, all the way up to this point. But, having the opportunity to come here, which was provided by Coach Ferentz, and then, being able to have the 3-year opportunity to learn everything that you could from Norm Parker and Phil Parker was something that, has shaped my career more than, probably, other than growing up a coach's son, has shaped my career more than anything else. In the 24, 25 years that I've been coaching. And, so that opportunity, would, if it never presented itself, And if I didn't fully take everything that I could, in that 3-year window of being around Norm and Phil from a defensive standpoint, I don't know that, this conversation probably would be happening right now. So the significance behind that, and the timing of it, and being a kid from Iowa and growing up watching this program, and then being able to be a part of it, at an early stage in your career has certainly shaped me in most every way from a coaching standpoint.
How do you feel like you've grown or developed as a coach, from since your return to Iowa in 2010 to now in 2025?
Yeah, I got back here in I got back here in 2014 after a 5-year stint at Valdosta State down in Georgia, which that would probably be the second most influential portion of my career. Just getting outside the geographic footprint of the Midwest and being down immersed in everything that is football in the Southeast, like that played a real big role in my career, probably second to the opportunity that I had here as a GA. But it gave me the experience that I needed, that wasn't gained being here in the Midwest to ultimately come back here in 14. And I share with you, to answer your question, between 14 and right now, I've had the opportunity to serve in various capacities on our staff, to include coming back here as an assistant to Reese Morgan, working with our defensive line for 1 year, while serving as the recruiting coordinator on the first 2 years of my time being back here. And then transitioned in my second year to a spot that was probably a little bit more familiar to me, which is working with Phil in the secondary. And then our linebacker coach left in right after the 15 season, and then that's when I transitioned to becoming the linebacker coach, and then shortly thereafter becoming the assistant defensive coordinator. So I just I think there's opportunity and experiences that have happened in the last 9, now going on 10 years, or 10 going on 11, being back here, that have kind of shaped where I'm at this point. And it's been rewarding. It's certainly something that I'm extremely thankful of, because it has allowed me in my journey at this point in my career to really take on a lot of different opportunities and experiences, and have kind of given myself a position where maybe you put yourself in an area in which you got opportunities moving forward as well.
With that Illinois State game, as assistant head coach, then Kirk can't coach in that. You take on that headset that the only person who's done that since 1999 was Kirk. What was that experience like in terms of putting on that head coaching headset for that game?
Yeah, John, it was it was certainly a welcomed opportunity. Not necessarily something that that you plan for, not something that you work for. But I know I said this last year, when that opportunity came about. I've got a father that was a head coach for a long time, and then I've certainly continued to pay attention to that position. And when you have the opportunity to work for somebody on on the level in which we all have the chance to here with Coach Ferentz, like you'd be crazy not to pay attention to everything that he does, as long as it's not taking time away from your primary responsibility. But I did a lot of and have, during the course of my career, I've just admired the head coaching position, and that starts with with my father. But and then I've also respected the position as well. So, I wasn't necessarily ready for that opportunity. And it was somewhat of a short term parking when you talk about the 24 hours that I was in that role. But we've got such a good staff here, and I say good, it's a great staff. And because of that, it ran like it should. And outside of the big decisions and the big things that have to be have to be done on game day, it was business as normal. And our players were outstanding in regards to it, and so was the staff. So it was fun to be in that moment. And there's a lot that I'm thankful for, to include having that opportunity, much like I've had the opportunity to transition in other ways in my career as well.
A little different when the 4th and 1 call is in your hands.
Was it 4th and 1 or was it 4th and 2?
I'm trying to think. I think it might have been 4th and 1.
Yeah, I mean I think that was the 5th series of the game. I'm trying to plug this in. That was the 5th series of the game. And if you recall, like, we just, we were struggling to get anything going offensively. And those decisions, they have to be made with a lot in consideration. And the one thing that stood out to me is we were playing well defensively at that point in time, and we were on the short side of the field. It was 4th and 1. Like I said, I think it was 5th or 6th series of the game. It was somewhere in the back half of the second quarter, and I felt like, okay, we're out of field goal range. Defense is playing well. If we can get this over the hump and we can pick up this first down, that maybe this will be the thing that'll get us going offensively. And it didn't work. We didn't pick it up, and ended up having to take over defensively there. And we were in a good situation, at that point in time defensively. So, those are decisions that you make with everything being considered. And certainly when your defense is playing well, you can take a chance like that and see if that might be the one thing that gets you, the traction that you're looking for offensively. But yeah, it was, those are the bigger decisions that you make when you're in that role. And, the other stuff is, talking to the team before the game, talking to them at the pregame meal. Obviously what you share with them after the game is pretty important, and certainly at halftime. But the bigger ones, as it exists in game, is your decision making in situations like that.
Would you like to be a head coach at some point in the future?
To answer your question, yes. Having been in that role for 24 hours, yes, I would. But I'll remind you, John, it is, it's not something that you work towards. I think it's a body of work thing. I think it's, a timing thing in some cases. And then, I think it's being, it's something that comes with recognition to, what your primary responsibilities are in regards to, being, the assistant defensive coordinator and the linebackers coach and the players that you've coached. And, to me, it's a byproduct of a lot of things. And it's not something that, that you set out to become. I think it's something that probably happens. And if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But, I've got my hands full right now. We started the conversation with the linebackers and, what that's going to look like, here moving forward. And that's my primary focus right now. But to answer your question, yes, if it ever presents itself.
If and when that opportunity does present itself, how much does that 24 hours where you're in that role, how much do you think that'll shape you as a future head coach?
Yeah, I don't know that the 24 hours is a big enough sample size. I think it's I think it's just, again, a byproduct of your experiences and your coaching career that will shape, the that would shape that opportunity. And having served here in multiple capacities, but having been around, I think it's more the people that you've been around and what you've learned from them. And there's been a lot of them. And, I go back to Norm Parker and the opportunity that I had there to learn from him, not only defensively, but just, football in general, the experiences that he's had in his career and how that shaped him. My short-term time with Greg Davis and him being a former head coach, and, I was around a Hall of Fame head coach down in Valdosta, and David Dean, and he's got 2 national titles to his career. So, having been around, a lot of people in a lot of different ways, I think will ultimately shape myself and has shaped myself up to this point. But, that would be what would shape, and provide me with, what is needed to be in that role. Not the 24 hours. Although it was certainly welcomed, and there were some things during the course of that 24-hour period that I think will play smaller pieces in having that opportunity.
And you've had good opportunities elsewhere that have come up. What has kept you here at Iowa for as long as you've been here?
Yeah, I think I would start with my family. As somebody that grew up in this state, and my wife and I have 2 young kids, and she's from Mount Pleasant and I'm from Grinnell, and both of our parents are around. And so, the opportunity that our kids, I say our kids, I'm talking about Landry and Macy, Erica and I's kids, the opportunity that they have to be around, their grandparents, and then, really what has been, given to me, in regards to this opportunity here, and the loyalty that I have to, not only Coach Ferentz, but also, the other members of our staff and people that have been very significant in my life. Just the opportunity to be here has, at this point in time, has been the right thing for myself and our family. And that's really what's kept me here. I said it a long time ago, there's a lot that pulls you back in this direction when other opportunities are being presented. And, that's not to say that I wouldn't, that there aren't some things that might pique my interest more than others, but, at this point in time, it's, this is where this is where I want to be, and this is what I want to do. So, I don't know that there's much more, that that goes into it other than, just the significance behind the family piece is pretty strong.
And then what's been kind of the most rewarding part from these 11 years here at Iowa?
The players, the guys that I've had the opportunity to coach, and to see, the Jay Higgins story, and even the Nick Jackson story, and, the other stories, and the way that they were shaped, and, where a kid was when he got here, and where he was when he left, both on and off the field development has been significant with everybody's story. But, just you look at Jay Higgins' story from this past year, and it is not the norm in college football. And it's a story that should be, it's a story that should exist in every locker room across the country, on how a young man came here and was under recruited, and, had his only Power 4 offer from Iowa, and took the chance to come here, and did it during COVID, and had to go through all the things that were the residual of that. And then had a Butkus award winner sitting in front of him at a time in which everybody else in the country in that situation would have said, well, I'm going to go somewhere else where I can play, and not have to sit, in this shadow for 2 or 3 years. And Jay just kept plugging away. And he just kept plugging away and plugging away and plugging away. And, ended up, becoming one of the best linebackers in the country and one of the best ones that we've had within this program. But his story, to include the way Coach Bell, went through the recruiting process with Jay and just kept hanging on with him and kept, delivering a message to me that, hey, there's this kid in Indianapolis that I think has a chance. And, he's being under recruited right now. And, I think there's a lot there. And then, most recently the Nick Jackson story, could not be any better from a transfer standpoint. It couldn't. And, so, those are the ones that, are come to mind, right offhand, because they were the ones that, were most recent. But, the stories that, that these young men have created, specifically to the linebacker room, have been pretty significant. Jack Campbell's, story, and Josie Jewell. I think Ben Neiman, take Ben Neiman for example. I think Ben's now 9 years into the NFL as an undrafted free agent. That doesn't happen. That much like Jay Higgins' story doesn't happen very often. Christian Welch was another undrafted free agent. Now he's been a captain on 2 different, NFL organizations. Like, those stories. But that is the story of Iowa football and the development of our players, across our roster at every position. And I know I'm speaking specifically to the linebackers, but gosh, I mean, those stories are no different than George Kittle's story or, Desmond King's story. It's just, there's a lot that I'm pretty thankful of, but it all starts with the players.
Well, Seth, thanks for joining me.
John, I appreciate it. Appreciate what you do for us. And, this is a welcomed opportunity, like any other that I've had, and always appreciate the way you've covered our program, and, look forward to, to the rest of the summer. And then, certainly as we get things going in August.
Thanks. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode. Until next time, we will talk Hawks later.